Hey up! Had a friend round tonight, and we were joined by John Barleycorn, and a good evening was had by all. My mate's gone home, but John Barleycorn is still here, and he's inspired me to create this video. I want to look at relations between Canada and the United States, in particular, what might happen if relations break down. Now, when you talk about war between the United States and Canada, uh, people tend to think that's a bit ridiculous. I mean, the two countries have the longest undefended border in the world. But it's not always been that case. The Americans have made several attempts to capture what used to be called British North America, often on the with the argument that a British occupation of that part of North America was illegitimate, and the people who lived there were just waiting for liberation by Uncle Sam's forces. Now, this is what we in the political science community call utter bollocks. Um, the Americans tried to capture Quebec during the War of Independence, believing erroneously that the Catholic French who lived in Quebec and had only been conquered by the British a decade earlier would rise up in support of Uncle Sam's liberators. They didn't. They fought with the British because Quebec is a Catholic French speaking colony, and the British recognized the French language as the language of Quebec, and they continued to allow the Catholic Church to be the established church of the colony. The Americans were made up largely of New England Congregationalist headbangers. And although the Quebec people did not like the English very much, probably hated their guts, if truth be told, they were still preferable to a bunch of New England headbangers. So, so they sided with the British, and the attack on Quebec was a failure. Generation later, during the War of 1812, the Americans, still not having learned their lesson, tried to capture British North America again and were turned back by the Canadian militias, helped, of course, by British regular redcoats. There were other attacks, some more serious than others, but at the end of the day, that there was nothing that the Americans could do, faced with, well, the British Empire and a navy that was the largest in the world. Nevertheless, the British were always concerned that the Americans would have another go. So in 1867, they bolted together all the British colonies in North America uh, and created, in effect, Canada. Canada was created largely as a defensive measure against the United States, with the promise or bribe that if the colonies agreed to this, then the British would fund a Canadian Continental Railway going across Canada from east to west. Uh, but the ideology behind it was strategic. It was to, if we have an entity with a government, then it can have an army that can defend Canada, or British North America as was, defend Canada against an American attack until such time as we arrive and drive the pesky Yankees out. Didn't happen. There was no wars. Canada, as part of the empire, fought with the United States against Germany during the Great War. Nevertheless, both the Canadians and the Americans felt that, yeah, possibly conflict could break out. So both sides drew up, in the aftermath of the Great War, war plans. How serious they were is anybody's guess, but they did exist. And what I want to look at today are those plans in some detail. Now, in 1921, the Canadians came up with Defence Scheme Number One. Defence Scheme Number One was, well, historians have said it was a crazy scheme. I'm not convinced. I think in the circumstances of the time, it might just have worked. The idea was that they would use the tactics that the Irish were using during their successful War of Independence against Britain, which was just coming to an end in 1921, whereby the Irish, instead of sending their guerrillas out on foot, sent them out in trucks. Using trucks, it will be obvious, means you can move your men around a lot quicker. These Irish flying columns, as they're known, were able to move, well, north, south, east, and west in Ireland, and the British were never able to get there in time to stamp them out. By the time the British had got their boots on, the Irish had left. So the Canadians thought to themselves, obviously, this might work for us. Does it sound crazy? Remember that the United States didn't manage to send a single military aircraft to Europe during the First World War. Their pilots had to use British and French aircraft. So, if the Canadians were planning to attack America using the flying column tactics that had been so successful for the Irish, then there's no reason why those tactics would have failed in the United States when the United States didn't have much of an air force. Here was the plan. War breaks out. On the day war breaks out, the Canadian flying columns attack the United States. Now, these are not really invasions. The Canadians didn't have the facilities to mount invasions. They are raids. Admittedly, raids on a giant scale, but they're still raids. On the Pacific coast, the flying columns would try to capture Seattle, Portland. Moving eastward, flying columns would try to go for Minneapolis. From Quebec, other flying columns would launch a surprise attack into New York with the aim of capturing Albany. And on the Atlantic coast, the flying columns would try to get as far south as they could into New England. Whether they really thought they could capture Boston, I don't know, but I suspect Boston would have been one of the aims. Now, obviously, eventually, these flying columns would meet resistance. And this is where the plan becomes rather good, because the aim of the Canadians was not to fight full scale battles, which they would have lost, in the United States. As resistance grew, the job of the Canadian Army was to retreat as slowly as possible and cause as much damage to American infrastructure as they could. So they would blow up every bridge as they crossed it. They would destroy as much of the railway infrastructure as they could, especially junctions where two or three railway lines came together. You could expect them to be blown sky high. Electricity generating plants would be destroyed. Uh, Gasometers would be destroyed. The idea was to leave the Americans with not a lot and slowly but surely retreat back to Canada, where the main defensive battles would be fought. Now, obviously, if it's just Canada on her own, eventually the Americans would win. So the Canadian plan was to buy time for the British to send their Royal Navy with troops across the Atlantic to resupply Canada or reinforce Canada. Unfortunately, the Canadians didn't ask the British what their plans were. If they had done, they would have had a surprise because the British didn't actually have a, a plan for war with the United States. They had, if they thought about it at all, already decided that sending a large army to Canada was a waste of time because, roughly speaking, the American army and the British army were about the same in numbers. The British couldn't win a war in North America, so they were prepared to sacrifice North America to make advantage in other areas. Inasmuch as the British had a plan for a war against the United States, it would have been fought in the Pacific. The British, probably using Indian Army troops, would have tried to capture the Philippines. They might, if things were going well for them, have tried for Hawaii. They would certainly have scooped up whatever American islands they could grab in the Pacific. Now, if you think about it, had that happened, I suspect that would have thrown America's war plans into disarray. You've built up your army, you're advancing into Canada, you're capturing American cities, and all of a sudden you're losing all your colonies in the Pacific. Those colonies were far more important than Canada, so I suspect the Americans would have um, withdrawn from Canada or drawn a defensive line in Canada and concentrated their attention on the Pacific. That would have relieved the pressure on Canada. So maybe the Canadians were not quite so insane as a lot of historians think when they consider the Canadian defense plan number one. What were the Americans going to do? Now, the Americans never planned a war against Canada. However, they did have a plan for a war against the British Empire. Now, this plan, it was called War Plan Red. It was for a war between Washington and London. And the Americans thought that the British would reinforce Canada, made the same mistake the Canadians made. So they decided that the first thing they would have to do is capture Halifax, which is the main port on the Atlantic front. And they decided they would do that by using poison gas. Once that was captured, the Royal American Navy would essentially blockade Canada to prevent the Americans to prevent the British from seizing a landing area to land troops, uh, and that was basically it. There were plans for attacking the Canadian cities, uh, but really the American plan was about preventing the British from reinforcing Canada. If the Americans could do that, then Canada could be reduced piecemeal because the American army was so much bigger than the Canadian. Now, the Americans suspected that the British would use imperial troops because part of War Plan Red is an assessment of British colonial troops. And the Americans were forced to admit that many of those, uh, quoting directly from the plan, many of those coloured troops were actually really rather good, especially when they had white officers. So the Americans knew that they had a war on their hands. And when they look at the consequences of defeat, which the plan does, the Americans say that if the plan did not go according to expected, the British would probably take Alaska off the Americans because the Canadians would demand that it be given to them as a prize of war. So don't lose, in other words. Given that the British were probably going to be fighting in the Pacific, um, and the Americans were planning to fight in Canada, really, God knows what would have happened had war broke out between the United States and the British Empire. Thankfully, it didn't. And both these plans eventually were just forgotten about. The Canadian battle plan at the end of the 1920s was declared null and void, and the Canadians stopped planning for a war with the United States. The Americans kept their war plan red, but they kept it in a drawer because they had other war plans. There was a war plan black for war with Germany, a war plan green for war with Mexico, and another war plan for war with the Empire of Japan. Uh, Japan and Germany, in the fullness of time, became enemies. Britain, the British Empire, never did. So we never got to see Canadian flying columns charging south towards Minneapolis as the Americans used poison gas against Halifax. Thank God. Right, there you go. Think on, folks.